Before we get started here, I need to make a quick correction. In the 1996 episode, the previous one, I said Michael Jordan took a break from basketball due to his HIV diagnosis. As a few people pointed out, that was incorrect, which is true. Magic Johnson took a break from basketball due to his HIV diagnosis. Michael Jordan took a break from basketball after his father passed away, and he wanted to give baseball a try. So we hold ourselves, of course, to the highest editorial standards here at the 80s and 90s Uncensored. And luckily, it's rare that we make a mistake, but I did misspeak on that episode. In my defense, I was hopped up on medications with a sinus infection, so maybe my lack of sleep contributed to my mixing of basketball superstars. Sorry about the error. Now, on to this episode. Kids, what year is it? It's 1997, and boy, was it a busy year. So let's just jump straight into news and events. Princess Diana died. That is still big news. So if that is that big of news now, just imagine what it was then. So on the night of 31st of October, 1997, Diana was in Paris with her boyfriend at the time, and they were basically being chased by paparazzi and got into a car wreck. So what happened was her driver of the car, his name was Henry Paul. He had a few drinks that night and was speeding, and nobody in the car was wearing seatbelts except possibly Dodie's bodyguard. It's a bit unclear on that doing the research, but basically the bodyguard was essentially the only one that lived. So anyway, Princess Diana was pretty much constantly being hounded by paparazzi back then. They were middle of the night, down the road, they're being chased, and they even tried at one point to have a fake car. So when they left the hotel where they were staying, which was owned by Dodie's family, they sent a limo out front thinking that the paparazzi would see that and chase it. But somebody found out that they were leaving in a different car from the back and were chased by the paparazzi. And of course, the driver, who was a little bit drunk at the time because he didn't think he'd actually be driving that night, had a few drinks and also apparently had some prescription drugs in his system, but more or less was speeding, trying to get away from the paparazzi. He lost control of the car at the Pointe de Alma underpass, traveling about 65 miles per hour, which was twice the speed limit, which was 31 miles per hour for the tunnel. It hit a stone wall, and Dodi Fayed died pretty much instantly. Diana was taken to the hospital, and she wasn't pronounced dead till 4 a.m., so they did try to revive her. Some of the photographers, when they reached the scene, actually did try to help. However, some of the photographers also took pictures because they're like, oh, well, those other photographers are helping. I might as well get the scoop and grab a picture, right? Jerks. People were really hostile towards these photographers. A couple witnesses apparently to the crash attacked some of the photographers. Some of them were arrested, but later let go. Yeah, it really sparked kind of this outpouring rage against paparazzi, who apparently haven't gotten the hint. I don't know, maybe they're better now. I don't know. I try not to pay attention to that kind of stuff. It really also sparked an outpouring of grief around the world, not just the United Kingdom, for Princess Diana. People loved her back then. They still love her. She was kind of the royal that everybody liked, the one that basically said, hey, this royal life sucks, screw you guys. I'm getting divorced. My husband's a jerk. He's in love with another woman. And I'd rather just like use my celebrity for good to help people with HIV infections, to help the poor, that kind of stuff. And it's unfortunate she didn't live because she probably could have done a lot with her life as a public figure. Prince Charles did go to the hospital, but obviously she was dead by the time they all arrived. She returned to the UK where there was a bit of debate about how she was going to be buried because technically she was no longer a royal. But the Queen gave in and was like, look, everybody loves her, so let's give her a proper funeral. It was watched by 2.5 billion people. So that's massive. Millions of flowers were left outside of her residence, and also the family estate in Althorpe. It was like so much. They were like, hey, please stop leaving flowers. Like, there's so many here. They're rotting. They're making a mess. We appreciate it, but how about you take some of that money and donate it to a charitable cause? The investigation after the accident put all the blame on the driver. He was 4 times the legal drinking limit in France. So if you're that drunk and you're driving a limo, get somebody else to drive. You know, come on, people. I mean, how many drunk driving accidents do we need to have in this world before people learn not to drive drunk and not say, oh, yeah, I'm fine. No, I'm good. So, yeah, so all the blame was put on him. But I think as a population, myself included, we put a lot of the blame on the paparazzi. The UK, speaking of, handed over Hong Kong to the independent rule. So basically, in July of 1997, the British colony, which began in 1841, was handed over. What it was is essentially a 99-year lease. So in 1842, there was the Treaty of Nanking, which ceded the island. And then 1898, they had what was called the Convention for the Extension of Hong Kong Territory, outlining the island's lease for 99 years. So in 1997, there were 6.5 million British people, or I guess Hong Kongians. Is that what they would call themselves? Hong Kongs? I don't know. Anyway, on the island and on the island nation, really, and it was handed over. Now they try to be a bit independent, but China is, of course, stepping in, and they've been in the news, not recently, but a few years ago, they were in quite a bit, and there were a lot of protests in Hong Kong, basically saying, hey, stop telling us what to do, China. The Mars Pathfinder landed on Mars. It was renamed, or the lander was renamed the Carl Sagan Memorial Station. It was a real wheeled robotic Mars rover, which was named Sojourner, and it was the first rover to operate outside the moon. It was launched on 1996 and landed July 4th of 1997. It carried a series of scientific instruments, atmosphere, climate, geology, rock, soil, that kind of stuff. Yeah, it was really kind of a cool piece of space news. I am often really annoyed by how much the US government spends on its military and how little in comparison it spends on to other stuff. I just imagine where we would be in scientific exploration of the universe if they spent even a fraction of what they spend. Well, I guess they do spend a fraction, but let's say spend a decent portion of what we spend on the military industrial complex on science and space exploration. We would certainly probably have a colony on the moon and possibly Mars by now, which we don't. And unfortunately, it's taking private companies like SpaceX in order to help move that along. So it's quite sad that we don't, but it was really cool news when that happened. And the rover was initially only supposed to happen for roughly a week to a month, but they managed to get it to operate for almost 3 months before it finally pooped out. Also in space news, Comet Hale-Bopp. Hale-Bopp! So the reason they call it the Hale-Bopp Comet is because it was discovered by Alan Hale and Thomas Bopp. They found it on July 23rd of 1995. However, you could see it in 1997. And it was referred to as the Great Comet of 1997. It was visible to the naked eye for 18 months due to its massive size, twice as long as the Great Comet of 1811, for people who remember that. I don't, which was the previous record holder. So yeah, it was cool. People love it when comets come around. We also had the Kyoto Protocol, which was signed December 11th of 1997. So this was the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that commits the signed parties to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now you have to remember this was 1997, so the majority of the world believed in, I don't know if they did actually, maybe not in the US, but anyway, it was governments. How about that? Majority of governments believed in global warming and science, and that humans' CO2 emissions were driving it up. And so they met and came up with the protocol, which was based on this idea that each country has a liability and a requirement in combating climate change due to their economic development. Of course, some more so than others. The US is a huge contributor to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere because of the industrial country that it is. China as well, India. The idea was that starting in 2008 and ending in 2012, all 36 countries that participated would comply with the protocol. However, some had the ability to be a bit more flexible based on their economies. So they also set up a carbon trading system to where like maybe you could trade with other countries and stuff like that to offshoot it. Later they had the Paris Agreement, which was kind of similar of it. They did have an enforcement system in mind. They actually was a branch that would basically say, hey, this country's not in compliance, and then they must make up the difference in some other way, that kind of stuff. But there was really no like, hey, if they don't comply, how is that going to be enforced? Initially, the U.S. signed the protocol on November of 1998 during the Bill Clinton presidency. However, it had to be ratified by the U.S. Senate, which basically said, nah, no, we're good. We don't want to do that. Sure, we could because we're a first world economy, but hey, we're not going to. So suck it, Bill Clinton and the planet. As of 2023, the U.S. still has not ratified the protocol, while the U.S. accounts for 36.1% of emissions. This is as per Wikipedia, so I don't know how updated this is or how accurate it is. But basically, I do know the U.S. accounts for a large percentage of global emissions. Canada, Japan, and Russia initially did sign on, but then they later withdrew from the protocol. However, the protocol did actually have some benefits, even though CO2 emissions have still gone up. Many countries are working to meet or have met their commitments to the protocols, as well as the Paris one later on. Let's jump over to sports real quick. One thing I want to mention in the sports world, Mike Tyson bites Evander Holyfield's ear in the third round of their heavyweight rematch. So yes, basically they had fought previously, and Holyfield retired in 94, and Tyson was getting a bit up there in years. But due to the money that could be made from this fight, they went in. In 1996, Evander Holyfield actually won. Everybody thought Mike Tyson was going to win. They fought 11 rounds, and Holyfield took the title from Tyson. And so Tyson's like, rematch. And Holyfield is like, all right, I beat you once, I can beat you again. So the next year they fought again, only went through rounds. Tyson was not doing well. He spit out his mouthpiece, bit off a chunk of Holyfield's ear, and spit it onto the canvas. So oddly enough, they actually did stop the fight for a bit, restarted it, and then Tyson bit his ear off again. So he was disqualified. He lost the money that he was supposed to make from the match. There's a really good documentary about Mike Tyson, and he talks about this moment. And basically, he's like, look, when I was young, I had it in me. I wanted to punch somebody so hard that like my fist would smash through their face. I had that desire to like win and just beat the other person. And at this point in his life, he's like, I lost that desire. I just didn't have it in me anymore. Biting a person's ear off? You could have just lost the fight, Mike. I mean, seriously. In the world of books, I think I'm going to mention one called Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, also known as Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. So this was J.K. Rowling's first novel in the Harry Potter series. We did an episode on J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter because, of course, this is a great book. Say what you will now about J.K. Rowling's politics. If you put that aside, this book got a lot of children reading. And that, to me, is important. It follows Harry Potter, who is a young wizard who discovers he's magic, and then he receives an invitation to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He quickly makes friends with Ron and Hermione and has to fight the Dark Wizard Lord Voldemort, who killed his parents but failed to kill Harry. It was a major award-winning book, New York Times bestseller. It's been translated into 73 other languages. Of course, it's been made into a feature film, along with every book made into a sequel as well. The novel sold 120 million copies, making it the fourth best-selling book of all time. So, interesting piece of trivia, it was submitted to 12 publishers, all of which rejected it, until Barry Cunningham, who ran the children's literature department at Bloomsbury Publishing, bought it after one of his, I think it was one of his agents or one of his readers, saw his 8-year-old daughter finish one chapter and wanted to keep reading it. So he's like, well, if my 8-year-old wants to read this, other 8-year-olds will as well. Turns out not only did 8-year-olds want to read it, adults wanted to read it. I don't know why any wizarding parents would send their child to Hogwarts, by the way, because bad stuff happens at that school. So stay away from Hogwarts. Send your kid to one of the other schools that teaches wizards, because they don't seem to have many problems. 1999, Warner Brothers purchased the film rights, and the rest is history, as they say. This book made J.K. Rowling a very rich person, to the point to where she feels she can say whatever she wants, which has caused a lot of people to not be fans anymore, which is unfortunate because these are good books and still worth reading. In the world of movies, you might have heard of something called Titanic. And if you were alive in 1997, which from our statistics, most of our listeners are or were, you also saw Titanic. And it's very likely you saw it in the movie theater because just about everybody saw that movie. It was huge. To give you an idea of how huge that film was, it, of course, was the highest grossing film of the year at number one. $1,843,201,268. The next movie on the list, The Lost World Jurassic Park, at number 2, $618,638,999. That's how huge this movie was. And there were a lot of big movies that year. Number 3 on the list, Men in Black, huge. Tomorrow Never Dies, James Bond, huge. Air Force One, Harrison Ford, huge, as good as it gets. Liar, Liar, My Best Friend's Wedding. The Fifth Element, The Full Monty, that's the top 10 that year. Every single one of these films is fantastic. I mean, I shouldn't say that. I've never seen My Best Friend's Wedding. I'm not really a rom-com person. But from what I hear, it's a great rom-com. Everything else I've seen, everything else is fantastic. So to top that list with such a number says how huge this film was. Everybody saw it. I can't spend too much time talking about this because I got to keep this episode under 30 minutes, but distribution for the film was split between Paramount and Pictures and 20th Century Fox because it costs so dang much money to make. It stars Leonardo DiCaprio, Kate Winslet, as everybody knows, James Cameron. What made this film unique is they actually shot at the wreck of the Titanic. 12 times they dived down to that, which is probably just James Cameron being like, man, I want to visit the Titanic. How can we get the studio to pay for this? So they also built a massive waterfront park in Mexico, building basically a replica of the ship. He did a fantastic job of mixing the CGI with the practical effects of the film so that it's totally not visible to people watching it, of like when it's switching back and forth. That's how good this film is. I saw it in the theater. I loved it. I bought the CD. The musical score was written by James Horner, who is probably one of the most brilliant film composers, possibly of all time. I don't know. I mean, look, he did Titanic. James Horner also did Aliens, Braveheart, Field of Dreams. I mean, on and on and on. So tons of great movies that he has scored, with this being one of them. And the film swept the Oscars that next year, winning 11 Oscars out of, I think, 15 nominations, 14 nominations, whatever the heck it was. It won a lot. And it's a timeless film, a bit cheesy now in retrospect in some ways, but I still like it. I think it's great. And I fell in love with Kate Winslet when I watched this film, and I still love her. She is beautiful and an amazing actress. And just in real life, I just love her opinion on things and like how Hollywood treats women and her openness about it. I think it's beautiful. Leonardo DiCaprio, of course, has always been a talented actor. So interestingly, he didn't really want to do the film at first and kind of had to be talked into it. So I bet he's glad he did. If you want to hear more about Titanic, we actually did an episode on Titanic where we really get into a lot more of the details. So check that one out if you'd like. I'm only going to mention one thing in the world of music. Well, I guess besides the James Horner mention I already did, and that's Lilith Fair. So it only ran for a few years, from 1997 to 1999. They tried to do a revival in 2010, but it didn't really last. So Lilith Fair was like the female-led alternative to Lollapalooza. It was created by Sarah McLachlan, who was annoyed that, like, back in the 90s, two female musicians wouldn't get played in a row. We talked about this actually in our country music episode. And so now that's not an issue, right? But back then, yeah, a radio station wouldn't play, say, a Sarah McLachlan song followed up by a Lisa Loeb song. They would mix some boy tunes in there, right? And so she's like, this is bullshit, man. I'm going to have a concert that's all women. And so the first one was in British Columbia in 1996. And that one had McLachlan, Paula Cole, Lisa Loeb, plenty of others. And then so the next year, she's like, wow, that did really well. Let's do the Lilith Fair as a tour. And so in 1997, they did it, and it was the top grossing touring festival of that year, grossing $16 million. McLachlan, like I said, did it a couple more times, but it just kind of fizzled out eventually. And I think a lot of that had to do with like women getting more airplay and not necessarily needing to, do something like this to get their music heard, right? There's a lot of great musicians that played there. Fiona Apple, Meredith Brooks, the Carnegans. A bit of a one-hit wonder, the Carnegans. But yeah, they were around. Tracy Chapman, Paula Cole, Sheryl Crow, Emmylou Harris, Jewel, who I totally love. Tons of fantastic musicians played at it, all women. And it did really well, and it showed radio stations that, hey, women can get an audience. Their music is fantastic, and people should listen to it. So suck it, Lollapalooza. In the world of television, Married with Children ended after 10 years. So it was the longest running sitcom at the time. Obviously has been beat out by other things, but at the time, 11 seasons, which is pretty impressive considering that it was on Fox, which was a relatively new station at the time and is well known for not giving shows the opportunity to last. But I think people seem to agree with me on this, because it was a new station and they didn't have a lot of stuff on there to offer. It allowed it to find its audience and last. And once it did, 11 seasons, 259 episodes. Love and Marriage, the theme song, everybody recognizes that as soon as they hear it. The show was critiqued because it had a dysfunctional family. It wasn't your Cosby Show or Family Ties. This was from the get-go, from the opening credits of Al Bundy sitting on the couch, just sadly handing out money to his family and just being miserable, and working at a women's shoe store, having to just suck life after a heyday as a football star in high school. That was his claim to fame. It was the longest running show to never win an Emmy until Baywatch. So congratulations for never winning an Emmy for running so long. It's a good series. It had a lot of great guest stars on it. Sam Kinison was a very memorable one. And if you haven't rewatched it, check it out. I like it. Buffy the Vampire Slayer premiered. So this was created by Josh Whedon, starring Sarah Michelle Gellar as Buffy, and it premiered on the WB channel. So this is another startup channel at that time that was looking to find its footing. And I think just like Married with Children on Fox, Buffy the Vampire Slayer helped the WB get noticed, but also the fact that the WB didn't have a lot to offer kept the show on the air probably longer than it might have been. Although, honestly, I think it kept it on the air too long, but that's just me. This was one of those shows when people would say, what's your guilty pleasure? I would say Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And at some point I realized, no, it's not a guilty pleasure. If something is pleasurable, don't feel guilty about it, right? So it's not a guilty pleasure. It's a pleasure. I loved this show. I still love this show. The first few seasons when they're in high school are the best because it's got the best kind of like one-liners. It's got the best quips. It's a bit lighthearted. The special effects are pretty cheap. That makes the show a lot of fun. And you've got Buffy who's like, man, I don't want to be a Slayer. I just want to like hang out with my friends and talk about boys and do that kind of stuff. But she got stuck. You can only have one. Well, until later on we find out. But yeah, it starred Allison Hannigan as Willow, who would later become a witch, Nicholas Brandon as their friend Xander, the fantastic Anthony Head as Rupert Giles, the stuffy Brit who is her guide, James Marsden, who wasn't originally supposed to be on the show as much as he was, but was such a fantastic character as Spike, got pulled back quite often. It goes on. I guess I should mention David Boreanaz, who was big in the first season, then, of course, got spun off to his own show. Seth Green, who I wish had stayed on the show more. I loved his character, and he was so cool. Charisma Carpenter, who initially actually auditioned for the role of Buffy, but they gave her that role instead. And oddly, Sarah Michelle Gellar initially auditioned for the role of Cordelia and got the role of Buffy. So this show was great for its strong female lead, its brilliant writing. It led to spin-offs like Angel. It had tons of tie-in products. It later led to comics, video games, novels, online websites, fan fiction that's been done. Josh Whedon, of course, has since gotten into some hot water with his treatment of women, which is bizarre if you think about his portrayal of them on the screen. But yeah, it's unfortunate, but the show is great. My opinion is that it went on too long. Could have probably ended a few seasons sooner, got a bit dark towards the end. At first, Buffy was kind of the reluctant Slayer, but then she just became the whiny Slayer. But it still had excellent episodes towards the end, just not as many as towards the beginning. In my opinion, other people, I'm sure, disagree. I loved this show so much that I had a coworker who had the VHS tapes of this. I borrowed them and copied the VHS to my own set of VHS tapes until the DVDs. And then I bought the DVD set. And of course, I had the CD because the CD had a lot of good music on it. I don't think I have any of those anymore, but I did at the time. This is a cult TV show. We talk about cult movies a lot, but we don't really talk about cult TV shows. This is one of them. I love it. Watch it if you haven't watched it. If you don't like it, I don't know if we can be friends, but I guess you're allowed to have an opinion. Anyway, I need to wrap it up here because I'm running out of time. I'm going to leave it real quick with saying goodbye.